Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
Using the two gold castings that you fabricated, we are going to splint these two castings together after proper positioning by using a Duralay acrylic. At that time, we will invest the splinted castings in a soldering investment and then burn the acrylic off. Using anti-flux, we will anti-flux areas where solder is not desired. That is the occlusal, buccal, lingual, and cervical areas of the crowns. And with control, we'll flux the areas where solder is desired. That is the contacting proximal surfaces. After investing these crowns in a soldering investment, we will solder the castings together using a 650 rod solder. And then after quenching and cleaning and pickling, we will shape and finish the solder joint area with a Volcarbo separating disc and with Moore's and sand and cuttle discs. Now, to start any soldering procedure, one must use flux. You have your SS White soldering flux. It's a green paste-like material. Would advise you, if you have not already mixed this flux up, to once again take your number 7 spatula and stir your jar of flux, mixing all the constituent parts of the flux together in such a manner. Now, it's by the use of this flux that we will cause the solder to flow in the areas that we want it to flow. If your flux sits around and is not mixed properly, you stand the chance of having an improperly soldered joint. Now, what we will do is to put flux on the proximal surfaces of these castings before we place them in position. So by picking up one crown, we will add a small amount of flux to the mesial proximal surface of the casting where we want the solder to flow. Now, this is a minimal amount. It's used to cleanse that surface to allow the solder to flow. And then we'll position our casting on our red utility wax. Sink it into the utility wax just a little bit to hold it in position, like so. You pick up your other crown and using a small amount of flux, add it to the distal proximal surface of the casting where you want the solder to flow to form the joint. And once again, taking this casting, putting it in position on your utility wax. It is highly essential that the castings touch one another on their approximating surfaces, and that the marginal ridges are of the same height. Now, this may take some adjustment, and you take your number 7 spatula and just seat your castings into your red utility wax. Now, when you're certain that your castings are positioned and that they're being held in that position, you may dispense a bit of Duralay powder and liquid into 2 dappen dishes. We'll use about a quarter of a dappen dish for this particular situation. In this case, I'm using a red Duralay for photographic purposes. As you know, you have a white Duralay, same material, and will react the same way. Adding a bit of powder to one dappen dish and some of the liquid to the other. This should afford us then the opportunity to join these two crowns together. Now we'll want to use an inlay brush, and we will add a bit of liquid to the surfaces that we want to join the acrylic to, essentially the occlusal surfaces across the top of these two castings. And when doing this, we'll touch our brush to the liquid portion, add a bit of liquid to our castings, dip our brush into the powder, and paint onto the occlusal surface some of this Duralay. And then wipe your brush off. Now, it's highly essential that you clean this brush each time that you go from liquid to powder and then back to liquid. Once again, going into the powder, and adding the duralay to the occlusal surfaces. Now, when you have an adequate amount, meaning that you have the surfaces covered, we want to solidify this splint by placing a paper clip across the two castings. The paper clip will go down through the central groove, is placed down into the duralay, and it will protrude out past the mesial and the distal surfaces of your two castings. Now, once again, once the paper clip is in position, we can go back and add some more of our powder and liquid, locking this paper clip onto the two gold castings, which will splint the two together, give us a more rigid binding so that when we take them off the red utility wax, they will not come apart. As it's in this fashion and that we will then invest these crowns into the soldering investment. Once again, I just must emphasize that you must dry off your brush when you go back into the liquid. Because if you add powder back into the liquid, it contaminates it and delays the setting time of your acrylic. Now, when you feel that you've locked that acrylic onto your castings, and I would feel that we have added enough at this point. We have the occlusal surfaces covered. It's gone down into the embrasure of the castings. We'll then allow this duralay to set up, and this usually takes anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes. And at that time, we'll take them off the red utility wax and add wax to the undersurface, and this will be demonstrated in the next scene. Now, to prevent soldering investment from flowing into the contact area, down into this particular area here, inlay wax or 28 gauge green wax is flowed into the soldering joint area, both buccal and lingual, to wax out the space where we would like the solder to eventually flow. So, heating your spatula, picking up some soft green wax, we will flow our wax into this interdental area. We ought to end up about a ½ millimeter from the cervical of the crowns. This will vary, of course. You rotate your crowns, add your wax into this particular area. Now, once in a while, the duralay will flow cervically, and the addition of the wax is very minimum. Whatever is necessary to block out this area is the amount of wax that you will add. This wax, of course, at the time that the invested crowns are heated, will burn out and leave a space. Now, if you'll smooth this wax out, it will leave the investment very smooth at that area. Now we have our wax flowed into the interdental area, and you can see that it has occupied a space where we want the solder to flow. You'll also note that there is an area of crown, of casting, cervical to that wax. I think that shows it very well at this point. Now, setting your crowns aside, we want you to construct a mold out of your red boxing wax. This comes in a white box in strips. And here is a model of such a mold. Now, the approximate size of this mold is about 1.5 inches in length, about 1 inch across, and about 3/4 of an inch deep. Now, the measurements that we are giving here are approximations. But this mold then will retain the soldering investment when we mix it, and allows you to place your crowns into the soldering investment without having the investment slump and causing your crowns to sink right on through it. So once you have constructed such a mold, you can set it aside. Take your rubber bowl with water in it, and I would say about 1/2 inch of water in the bottom of the bowl. And to this water, you will add your soldering investment. Now we're using the Ransom and Randolph soldering investment. Now we find that approximately 5 heaping half spatulas of investment will approximate the amount of material that we need. Now this again will vary. So we'll add a bit of our powder, you can see. If you make the mold rather large, of course, then it's going to require a lot more powder. Now we'll mix. This has a rather long setting time. It's not like your impression plaster, thing of that nature. I feel that our mixture is perhaps just a little bit on the fluid side, so we'll add a bit more powder to it. And now we've reached our more putty-like mass of material. Now the water-powder ratio, of course, in this is important. We want a strong investment, and we don't want it to take too long to set up. If it's too fluid, it's just going to take an extended period of time to set up. Now, once your mixture has been made, you set it aside, pick up your crowns, and you will paint in and vibrate in your soldering investment. Turning your crowns over, taking some of your investment on an inlay brush, paint down into the interior portion of your crown. Now, it is very, very important that you get your investment covering all of the surfaces of the interior portion of the crown. So that means that you don't want to add large increments at any one time. You want to get every air bubble out, because if you do not have the air out of these crowns, you'll have a spot that does not have investment in it, and it will probably burn up when you solder your crowns. Now, by tapping the crown, creating a vibratory motion, you'll get that investment to take its proper position. Once again, going down now into the other crown, teasing it into every portion of the cusps, and this is usually where you neglect to get your investment. You'll find that you can very easily cover these crowns. Once again, just tapping. You could run this on a vibrator if you had a vibrator right handy, and vibrate that investment down in there, filling the crowns up to the cervical edge of the gold. Will allow us then to insert the castings into our mold that has been filled with investment and have them attach themselves and be rigidly held in position. Now our crowns are filled. Just roll that over like so. Painting our investment there. We set our crowns down. We'll pick up our bowl, and we can flow our investment into our mold. Now you can see that if you didn't have a mold, that this would slump on your glass plate and would not allow your crowns to be held in position. Now once you have your investment in your mold, you see that we have filled it up to the upper rim of the mold, you can take your crowns and insert them into this investment. Now the crowns ought to be inserted into the investment about half of the length of the crown. And you'll find by just setting the crown in there and just gently touching the investment around it, the crown will sink to the position that you want it. And if you want to insert them, just gently, very gently, just touch them, like so. Now one of the very important parts of this investment is to develop a buccal and lingual trough. Now these troughs are established, actually cut in here with the point end of your number 7 spatula as your investment begins to harden. When the investment is still soft, it is somewhat difficult to maintain the trough, but the trough affords us an opportunity to introduce heat into that embrasure or into the interdental area, to open up that area so that we can see the wax from the buccal and from the lingual, And when this wax is eliminated, it allows us to see right through the interdental area where we want our solder to flow. So as our investment begins to harden up, we will gradually develop these troughs. Now, if you don't have enough investment in the area around it, it's a very simple thing just to push a little investment over to it. Developing it from the lingual with the point end of your number 7 spatula, you'll see that you can begin to cut these troughs in here. And you see them being developed. Now over on the buccal side, once again, we will cut our trough in here. Now as the investment sets up, as I said before, it affords you another opportunity to finish the cutting of these troughs. Now you'll note that the troughs, the triangular grooves, have been cut into the investment and have exposed the interdental area that is occupied wax down to the cervical portion of the wax on both the lingual and on the buccal side. When this has been accomplished and you are satisfied that you've opened this area up, you can then strip off your red boxing wax and expose the rest of your investment. This is best accomplished by just slitting the wax down the side and then gently removing this boxing wax. Now the importance of having this boxing wax around there to create a form for you allows you to have an investment that, as we mentioned before, has the measurements of about 1.5 inches by 1 inch across by about 3/4 of an inch wide. Now if you've done this, then it would not be necessary for you to model trim. If your investment has a shape other than this more ovoid type of configuration, you might want to go to the model trimmers and trim it into this form. What is important, however, is that with a knife, you round the edges of your investment. In so doing, the round surfaces will absorb the heat and allow you to get a greater amount of heat into your investment in a shorter period of time. Using your laboratory knife, you can very, very easily accomplish this. Trying not to create any sharp corners on your investment. Now with a brush, of course, brush off any loose fragments of your investment so that the area is cleaned off. Now, at this point, our next procedure is to get rid of the duralay on the occlusal surface of the castings. This is best accomplished by taking your investment in your soldering tongs and heating it over a Bunsen burner. Now you don't want to burn the duralay necessarily, you want to soften it. And this may take several trials. You heat it, set it down, take a number 7 spatula, and see if you can lift this duralay off like such. Now you'll note there's the configuration of the duralay splint. It has been lifted clean of your castings. Your casting is being held rigidly in place by the investment. Now turning our investment up, I would like to call your attention to the residual duralay and green inlay wax that has remained in the interdental area. Now it will be necessary to eliminate this, and this will be accomplished in the soldering technique after we add the anti-flux to the appropriate areas. This will then be the next step in the soldering technique. So that we may add our anti-flux to our castings, a substance of chloroform and rouge is mixed together to form a paste in a dappen dish and then is brushed on in the appropriate areas. You'll see that a few shavings of rouge has been put into the tapping dish, some chloroform added to it, and we now have a paste that we can paint onto the castings. Of our invested crowns, we can start our painting across the occlusal surface at the position of the triangular fossa, keeping our anti-flux away from the embrasure, ending at the height of the marginal ridge. It is painted down the lingual surface at the line angle, and this will confine our solder to the interdental area, the contact, and the embrasure. Going down the buccal surface of this crown, then transferring our attention to the other crown, painting across the occlusal, up the buccal surface, and up the lingual surface at the line angles. Now the band of anti-flux is about 2 millimeters wide. It is not necessary to cover the entire occlusal surfaces. It's just a substance that will confine the solder to the area that we wish the solder to flow. Now at this point, we will begin our soldering technique by first burning out the residual wax and residual duralay that exists in the interdental area. I would like to review for you the lighting and the adjustment of your gas torch. You've been using your torch for casting your various inlays. We are going to use a different sort of flame for this exercise, and I think that it's highly essential that you realize and recognize the importance of adjusting a torch properly to get the maximum amount of benefit from it. First of all, our source coming from our valves, our gas source is hooked up to the valve that is the red valve on your torch. This is always opened up in its entirety so that the gas, when turned on at the source, comes through to the torch and then out the nozzle full force. The other side of the torch, the green valve, is hooked up to the air source, and this valve also is opened up entirely. It's highly essential that these valves at the torch be opened up completely because this will keep you from blowing the hoses off the torch or off the source valves. We're pointing to this green valve and emphasizing the fact that it is absolutely necessary that this valve be opened up completely. Our gas valve is open. We are going to turn our gas on at this point, take our striker, and light our torch. And when our torch does light, it flares out. You want to always be sure, of course, I think you know this by now, to point the torch away from you. We are now going to turn our air on at our source valve, and we will turn the air on until we get a discontinuous flame. Now, for every casting exercise, this is the way you should operate your torch, and you will see just there at the point of the arrow the discontinuous flame. Now, to get the flame focused the way we want it for melting our metal for casting, we'll adjust our red valve, gradually cutting down on the gas supply to our torch. And gradually you'll see the flame become continuous so that we can then focus the point of this flame on the metal for melting purposes. Now you begin to see this flame draw together, and by pointing to the spot right there where it was discontinuous before, it is now continuous. Now once we have our casting flame, and of course this is the one you've been using, then we can take a very close look at it and break down the component parts of this flame. You have a little better understanding. Now we're pointing to the air blast area, that darkened area. As we proceed out, we get into the combustion cone, and this is a more blown up view of it. You can see this air blast, darkened area, wide in this particular case. Gradually as we proceed down the flame, we will come into the combustion cone at the tip of the air blast. gradually working our way down the flame towards the reducing cone. Here we're pointing to the combustion cone, and now heading out to the outer edge of this flame is the reducing zone, and that's where the maximum heat is obtained, and this is what the point that is focused on your metal when you're trying to melt it. And fading out into the oxidizing zone, and of course this has no heat to it at all that would cause your metal to melt. Now we're going to adjust our flame down to the soldering flame. First of all, we'll cut our air back, and of course this broadens the flame out, and then we'll draw the flame back in by adjusting the gas valve at the torch. And you see that our flame has become smaller and more pointed, more direct. It's more of a brush-like flame. Further adjustment on the air, and then further adjustment on the gas, getting that flame down to the type of flame that we want to use to solder. Now, taking a close view at our soldering flame, once again, breaking it down into its component parts, you'll see that the parts have been drawn closer together. The air blast is smaller, more distinct, and becomes more pointed as we go out towards the edge of the flame. We're going to gradually go point at the combustion cone and work our way on out to the reducing zone of this flame. And in this particular case, it is at the point of this reducing zone, and we're pointing at it right there, that we focus on our investment. And of course our oxidizing zone is out beyond that. Now here's a picture of the two flames comparing one with the other. First of all, the soldering flame. You'll note again that the air blast is very narrow, and compared to the casting flame, where you see it's quite wide and quite drawn out. You see that the casting flame is larger. And here we're pointing at the reducing zone, right at the point that we want to focus on our investment. And then down at the reducing zone at the point of the flame, you see that it's broader. It occupies a larger area. And then, of course, the area beyond the flames is the oxidizing zone. And that is the oxidizing zone. And then, once again, pointing to the oxidizing zone here. The entire investment is either placed in a room temperature oven and raised to 1100 degrees, or placed on a wire gauze and set up on the top of a ring stand and gradually heated with a torch, taking 2 or 3 minutes to raise the temperature of the investment. The major objective in this instance is to burn off all of the residual acrylic and wax. Now, if your investment was heated in the inlay furnace to 1100, then it is now removed and placed on the wire gauze and ring stand for soldering. Now we will proceed, in this case, to burn off this residual acrylic and wax. Using our soldering flame, brush-like, we'll gradually introduce flame, and you can see the bubbling of the residual wax and the acrylic burning out of the inner dental area. Coming around to the buckle. Making sure that that embrasure and inner dental area where you want solder to flow is completely cleaned and void of the acrylic and the wax. Now we have the residual wax and acrylic burned off. Using a Ward's carver, we can introduce some SS white soldering paste into that embrasure. We don't want to get a lot on, but approximately that amount, and flow down into that area, and you'll see it bubble right on through. At this time, we will place a Bunsen burner underneath the investment to heat the investment from below, because it's by doing this that we will draw the solder cervically. The solder will flow towards the hottest area. Heating from underneath and heating with our torch, we can get the solder to flow down into that inner dental area and get the right shape to it. Now, a small piece of solder can be introduced to the embrasure up on the occlusal surface. Now, we've placed this, and we'll tease it back lingually just a little bit, get it right about in the center from buccal to lingual. Now we'll begin to heat our investment with our soldering flame, moving around but heating only the investment. Now I'll concentrate the flame on the investment. Now perhaps in the camera we can pick up this little focal point on our investment. You'll see a black center, a red area, and then a little black center. Now you see that little black spot. Now that's the focal point, the hot spot of our flame. And that's the one we want to focus on our investment. Now we'll move our torch around to the buckle and heat on this side too. Now keep in mind that the little piece of solder that we have up on the occlusal portion is the indicating piece of solder. Well, when that flows, then we'll know that our crowns are hot enough for solder. Usually they'll take on an appearance of a cherry red color. We've inserted our rod of solder into a mosquito hemostat, and we have fluxed the rod of solder so that it too is cleansed. Now we move our torch around, keeping that focal point on the sides of the investment. Now it'll take a while for you to get your investment raised to the temperature that will impart a heat to the crowns that will make the solder flow. You should note that I am not concentrating the focal point of this flame on the crowns at any time at all. If I did that, then the solder would flow up the occlusal and it would not go down between the crowns. Now we're getting near that point where this little piece of solder will flow. And when it flows, you'll see it flash down between the crowns. Now you begin to see it go, and now it flashes down between. Now at this point, we can bring our rod of solder around and introduce some of it from the buckle. See our solder jump right down into that interdental area. Now we'll flow a little more solder right into the buckle, like so. You see the very shiny solder that has gone down. Now we'll go around and we'll heat our investment from the buckle, and we can introduce a little more heat and make that solder undergo a final flow. And that's what we're doing now. All right, now our joint is soldered, and we can turn our torch off, turning our air off and then our gas. We'll leave our investment cool down slightly, and then we'll place the investment with the castings into water, and we will quench it. We'll take our castings, retrieve our castings, and bring them back, and we'll put them into a coarse crucible with Prevox in it, and we will pickle these castings and clean them and getting them ready for a final finishing and contouring of this joint. Now we'll not take this joint through the polish stage. We'll only finish the joint. Now we'll take our investment off here, and I will put it into water and quench it. Take a look at our joint area, and you'll see the raw castings. See where the solder flowed. Turn it over. See that the solder flowed cervically. Now, by using the anti-flux in the areas that we indicated to you, you can concentrate your solder into that joint area. Now we'll place our castings into our crucible with our Prevox. Gently bring this to a boil. Now don't let it bubble and boil all over, or you'll splash and it's liable to burn you or contaminate the surface of the desk or the surrounding area. Just gently bring it, and you can see the castings in there gradually changing color. They take on a very gold sheen to them after they have been pickled and cleansed. I'll lift these castings out, and you'll get a chance to see the golden sheen that they have taken on. Sure, they're cleansed. remove the excess pre-box, and put our castings back into water and rinse them thoroughly. You'll see that they've taken on a brighter color now. So, now, taking a Valcarbo Joe Dandy disc, holding it with thumb support, going into the joint, allowing the disc to turn towards you, you can cut into that solder joint area and contour that joint. Now, if you've done your soldering correctly, you should have a minimum amount of finishing to do or of contouring. You're looking for a heart-shaped joint. One thing you must be very careful of is that the disc doesn't bind between the two castings and cause the castings to fly out of your hand and then possibly bend the margins of your castings. So now we've used our Valcarbo disc, we'll try to pick up the shape of the joint that we have imparted to this with the disc. Gradually rolling the castings over. You can see how we cut through the embrasure area there. That's the buckle, and you can see here the rather heart shape that we've imparted to this. That, I think, shows it very well. And there's the cervical part of the joint. Taking our sand discs, much the same as you did with your Valcarbo disc, we are now finishing this joint. Being, again, very careful that we don't lose the castings, meaning that we don't want the castings to go flying out of our hands. Now, once again, we're not interested in this exercise in you coming up with a pair of castings that are highly, highly polished. We want a good finished joint, and we want the castings finished around the soldered area. And see that we have our solder joint extending from near the buccal occlusal angles to the lingual occlusal angles on this occlusal surface. Turning the crowns, we'll see that the solder joint, as we hope we can, I'll roll it a bit for you here, is heart-shaped in its contour and extends approximately halfway down these crowns, but has not encroached upon the cervical of the crowns. This allows for freedom of flow of fluids in that cervical area and would allow the patient to tease dental floss underneath that solder joint.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.